Good evening. My name is Ann Birch, and I would like to welcome you to Trinity's Dillard Forum, whether you are here in person or live streaming this program from afar. An annual event designed to examine how faith communities speak to the 21st century. This forum was established to honor the late F. Douglas Dillard and his wife, Marion. Dr. Dillard served Trinity as a senior pastor and later as minister of congregational care, and it was his vision that brought this forum into being. Tonight, we celebrate a milestone with this 20th forum, and I believe Doug would be overjoyed with his legacy. This year, we are thrilled to have Dr. Norbert Wilson as our featured speaker to help us ponder his words, "To us who have bread, give the hunger for justice." Dr. Wilson comes to us from Duke Divinity School, where he is a professor of food, economics, and community, with a joint appointment at the Sanford School of Public Policy as the director of the World Food Policy Center. Before arriving at Duke, he was a professor of food policy at the Friedman School of Nutrition Science and Policy at Tufts University. His degrees and credentials are numerous, and his career path has evolved as he has served on the boards of and worked with several organizations concerned with agricultural economics. He began working on international trade at Auburn and later ended up focusing on work around communities struggling with food access. Dr. Wilson is ordained as a deacon in the Episcopal Church, USA. With his background in food policy and his work in the Episcopal Church in the Diocese of Alabama, he is uniquely positioned to talk about the justice, or lack thereof, in food policy, food security, and food access. Norbert is the husband of Dr. Wylan Wilson, who is also a faculty member at Duke Divinity School, and he's father to Amani Wilson. At the end of his presentation, Dr. Wilson will answer questions from those here in the sanctuary, as well as any submitted in the live stream chat function. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Wilson to Trinity.
Thank you so much. It's a real honor to be here, and it is a great pleasure. I have been intrigued by Dr. Dillard's contribution and his vision to have an annual lecture series. A church that is engaged in the intellectual life is a good church in many ways. And it's clear that Dr. Dillard cared about this community and cared about the life of the mind. I am humbled to be here. I'm grateful to be here and to have this opportunity to share with you. I have to give a great deal of thanks, and I hope that I do a good enough job because Mrs. Birch has been extremely kind to me. She reached out to me and has been supportive of making sure that this worked out. So I do hope that I provide something of worth. I must admit that I'm getting used to the technology, so forgive me if I stumble a little bit, but we're going to make it work. So I want to thank the pastors here who've been very kind. So I want to actually, with your permission, I'd like to open us with a prayer. And it's actually a grace. It's a very short one. And it goes, "O God, to those who have hunger, give bread. And to us who have bread, give us the hunger for justice. Amen. This prayer has always struck me. Supposedly, it is a Latin American grace. We hear from it this clarity of the unfortunate experiences of too many people worldwide and in our communities. We hear in sharp relief a simple dialectic, the need of the hungry and the hope for justice from those who have resources. The hungry and the fed coexist, not as opposing forces, but as neighbors. The prayer brings to mind the simple reality that we live in a land of plenty where there still are great needs. The prayer is a hope that those who are needing, they are pleading to God that those who can do something can actually help meet this need. Without blaming the hungry or the fed, the prayer clarifies that injustice is the border between the two, the fed and the hungry. However, the onus, the responsibility is clearly on the fed to do something to extinguish or at least mitigate this injustice. My prayer for our time together is to stoke a hunger in you for food justice, to address food security in this country. In my time with you, I will discuss food security challenges in this country from a social scientific perspective. I will later explore how churches and community groups can think differently about serving those in need. But I must make one thing clear. The challenge of food insecurity is not simply more food or more charity. People who struggle with food access, they simply need resources to meet their family's needs. While I believe that God calls us to provide hospitality, to extend ourselves, to meet the needs of those who are lacking, we must strive for a just distribution of resources so that all are fed. For the two lectures that I will present, I will share some statistics, I will discuss some policy, and reflect on some theology. I will discuss disparities in food access in the U.S. along racial and ethnic lines. I will discuss issues of racial discrimination that contribute to food insecurity, and I will lay out some of the facts from the academic literature and share a bit of my story. Now, of course, you are free to decide as you may, and I am, of course, painfully aware of the polarization in our nation. I did not want to surprise you by raising these issues, but I think it's important for us to have an honest conversation around these topics. As fellow travelers of the way, I firmly believe that we can discuss uncomfortable and challenging issues and still love one another. I ask that you walk with me on this journey. Now, I must make a confession. While I do work at Duke Divinity School, I also work at the Sanford School of Public Policy. My training is as an agricultural economist, and Dr. Norris is one of my colleagues. All of my degrees are in agricultural economics. I went to the University of Georgia, the 1862 land grant, which I'll talk a little bit more about, which is similar to Virginia Tech, where I still have some friends there. As a social scientist, and I know maybe Virginia Tech is great for some, but maybe not for others. As a social scientist of agriculture, I work with data and statistics, which you will see shortly. My training has taught me how to encourage the production of goods with fewer resources, to generate profits, to maximize the welfare, that is, the well-being of a society in financial terms. My training taught me to believe in markets and be a capitalist. However, common discourse in divinity schools sometimes question capitalistic systems and speak more generally of God's economy, where there is abundance. The education, the training that I've gone through is about seeing the world as one where there are limited resources that markets can distribute efficiently. While we economists use math and statistics to evaluate the efficiency of that allocation. Holding on to my training, my colleagues are honestly slowly reforming me, but please don't let them know this. However, it is critical that you understand this part of my background so that you can see the context of my talk a little bit more clearly. Nevertheless, I deeply appreciate the land-grant systems. Universities like Virginia Tech, University of Georgia, University of Maryland, and many others. In addition to these colleges, we have what's called the Cooperative Extension Service that provides support to farmers with information about farming practices and finance. Homeowners may call up their local extension office to learn about houseplants and fire ants. The Extension Service also provides nutrition and food information, especially for families in need. This Extension Service and the larger land-grant system formed me. I am standing here today because of my undergraduate and graduate trainings at two 1862 land grants. Now, as a child in Southwest Georgia, my first exposure to the land grant system was through 4-H. Run by the Cooperative Extension Service in each state, 4-H is a youth organization that teaches children disciplines commonly found in colleges of agriculture, human sciences, forestry, and veterinary medicine. 4-H had a particular role in my formation. I grew up in a community where racial segregation ruled our lives. A 1977 Washington Post article reported on my hometown on Dawson as follows: "There are two worlds here, one white and one black, and it is of little consequence to which one you belong, because the duality is pervasive and all-encompassing." In my youth, schools, recreational facilities, and even the doctor's offices were segregated. However, the one place of integration, at least in my life, was the 4-H club. From the local to the national level, 4-H gave me experiences in interacting with people from all races to learn and to grow. Now, strengthened by my community, I gained from these interactions the confidence to stand before a diverse audience and to share my work, my thoughts, and my life. Because many people poured into my life, I felt a deep sense of a call to service. However, I have struggled with this call. Through much of my training and my early career, I saw as my goal was simply to survive. Passing exams, writing a dissertation, going through faculty ranks seemed like such uphill battles that I am surprised as anyone that I'm here. However, to achieve these goals, I needed to do work acceptable to the profession. And I'm sure many of you have also experienced that decision of, do I do the thing that I think is important, or do I meet these expectations? Early in my career, I had a goal of working on justice issues as they related to my mostly black community. However, I had a senior professor tell me not to work on anything dealing with black people. The individual was not against the work. Actually, he was more concerned about my success because he knew that if I pursued those areas, I would have difficulty surviving in the profession. So I complied. To be clear, abiding by the dictates of the profession, or in my world, the discipline, is important to have clarity in our work. It is to help us decide what are the proper ways or methods and how to ask questions in understandable terms. I appreciate the role of a discipline or my discipline in keeping us from making errors in our analysis and providing clarity. Further, universities, companies, institutions, churches have cultures and ways of being and knowing. To survive, most of us find our place in that culture and we fit. However, disciplines, institutions, they can stifle us. I originally went to graduate school to study rural development. I wanted to help my hometown. I wanted to help communities like mine do better. However, that wasn't really an option, or at least not one that I could figure out how to pursue. During my formation, unbeknownst to me, there was a growing intellectual and policy discussion that was on a topic that was very close to me and to my community, and it centered on justice. Just didn't know about it. And it was about food insecurity. Growing up, I was unfamiliar with this technical term, food insecurity, but I saw it in my community. The economy of Dawson, Georgia, was stagnant. The employment opportunities dwindled over time, and we experienced out-migration. We had textile mills in the community and came to town, but the factory burned down, and folks, to keep their jobs, had to drive at least an hour away to the next facility. Economic opportunities remain limited in my home community and in many rural communities like mine. And these challenges spill over into shaping how community members are able to access food. At the same time, this community was an agricultural community. Driving through the county, you can see peanut fields and cotton and corn. In the fall, like this time of year right now, if you drive through my hometown, you can smell the scent of peanuts roasting for peanut butter. It just wafts through the community. You literally could smell the agriculture in the air. Yet, even though agriculture supported some in the community and it surrounded the community, most of the community was not directly engaged in agriculture. And as a result, this critically important economic driver in that community did not drive out hunger. Paradoxically, but strangely not surprisingly, food insecurity persisted in this agricultural county. Now, the consensus agreement, let's see if I can make this work. Sorry, folks. Yeah, sorry, yes. The consensus agreement of the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization at the World Food Summit back in 1996 states that food security exists when all people at all times have physical and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food that meets their dietary needs and food preferences for an active and healthy life. A definition of food security from a body so disconnected from my community reflected an unsettling reality. Not all people had access to sufficient food at all times. In Dawson, we knew folks struggled. Food pantries were not readily available, but churches provided food, especially at Thanksgiving and Christmas. Meals at youth programs provided some kids with, especially during the summer, with a bite to eat that they weren't sure would happen at home. Suppers with family and fictive kin provided the sustenance needed when the cupboards were bare. The community's response to the need was to provide, not to assess. However, we academics, we sometimes exist outside of community. Our natural inclination is to observe and measure from afar. In her seminal text, Janet Poppendike wrote Sweet Charity, and she explains that the early measures of hunger in the United States were crude at best. For example, there were counts of the number of people who visited a food pantry. However, clarity on food access challenges began to emerge such that by the 1970s, surveys were in place to begin to evaluate food sufficiency for households in the U.S. And by 1995, the U.S. Census Bureau introduced the Household Food Security Supplement in what's called the Current Population Survey that the U.S. Department of Agriculture uses to evaluate food security in America. The Food Security Supplement is a series of 10 questions to assess access to food. 18 questions if there are children present in the household. Now, I want you to consider the context of this survey. The federal government samples people from each state as part of that current population survey. In December of every year, the officials call households and ask questions about the well-being of those households. Researchers have validated this survey with 2 National Academy studies and extensive research supporting its use. However, I've often wondered, how do these questions land with people in the U.S. who are undocumented? Families that are experiencing the stress and worried about how the government would respond to their struggles to feed their children. While I believe in the statistical sampling, and I believe that it probably works, I am unclear on how the government adequately represents unhoused persons with this telephone survey. Nevertheless, this official survey tells us the challenge of food security in our country on an annual basis. The questions ask respondents to look back over the last 12 months to assess if the respondent and their household worried about food, had difficulty with the availability of food, and to what extent experienced the consequences of not enough food in the household. Some of the questions are: we worried whether our food would run out before we got money to buy more. Another question, and they get progressively more challenging: the food we bought just didn't last. We didn't have enough money to get more. In the last 12 months, did you lose weight because there wasn't enough money for food? In the last 12 months, and this is the most difficult of those questions, did you or other adults in your household ever not eat for a whole day because there wasn't enough money for food? Yes or no? And you can imagine that the household surveys for children also include questions about the challenges that children face in the household. The questions focus on financial capacity, or lack thereof, to feed the household. Thus, in theory, if a household depends on a neighbor, family member, or a food pantry, they may answer those questions affirmatively. However, what does it mean to assume that for a household to be food secure, they must have the financial resources to support themselves? Where do community and hospitality fit into this definition? The research on this measure of food security began back in the 90s. As earlier leaders in the field were critical to developing this measure that's run by the Economic Research Service of the U.S. Department of Agriculture, we should not be surprised by the leaning in on economics of food access, as opposed to the community food access. Many of my colleagues who began the body of research on food security and its related measure, food sufficiency, mostly consider this measure in light of the Food Stamp Program, or SNAP as it's called today. But in time, my colleagues and folks working in nutrition and medicine and public health began to see critical connections between food security and the myriad of social and health challenges. People who struggle with food access are facing significant challenges. You see, researchers began to see the connection between food insecurity and things like diabetes, cardiovascular disease, obesity, anemia, and overall poor health. Now, it may seem odd that struggles with food access relate to diet-related diseases. Still, evidence suggests that families that struggle with food access tend to eat lower quality diets than families with higher incomes. However, it is important for me to note that the dietary guidelines for Americans makes very clear that most, if not all Americans, really do fail to eat a nutritionally adequate diet. But folks who are low income, who struggle with food access, find it even more difficult. Children who grow up in households that experience food insecurity and children who are food insecure tend to face lower human capital development, that is, skills development in terms of education and training, and they ultimately end up with lower adult earnings. As a result, children who grow up food insecure have greater odds of being poor in adulthood. Policymakers should be concerned about this challenge for our citizenry regarding economic growth and, honestly, national security. Health professionals should respond because of the ongoing and long-lasting health costs to the individuals, but also to our society. We in the church should care because God desires to see human flourishing. In the development of this research, one person stands out to me, and it's because it's personal. Patricia Duffy was a colleague of mine at Auburn, and she was vital to talking through some of these challenges. She collaborated with people from outside of our department, with sociologists, nutritionists, and others, to explore how the charitable food sector supported and honestly sometimes failed to support food security. Patricia introduced me to this work and led me to serving on the food bank of the board of a food bank in East Alabama. In addition, she gave me insights into a challenge that I knew from my home community, which still persists today. Oops. And I realized that my slides may be a little bit small, so I'm going to just have to paint some words and we'll make it work. So in 2019, the pre-pandemic food insecurity prevalence in the U.S. was about 10.5%. The national prevalence of food insecurity had finally reached rates similar to those before the 2007 to 2009 Great Recession. Please understand that leading up to the Great Recession, food insecurity rates, that is the percentage of households that struggle to access food, was anywhere between 10 to 12%. But when the Great Recession happened, food insecurity rates rose to 14 to 15%. Finally, it took a long period of time till 2019 when the food security rate finally got back to the pre-recessionary rate. That same year in Georgia, my home state, the food insecurity rate was about 12%, which was a little bit higher than the national rate. However, Feeding America, the large organization that manages many of the food banks around the United States, predicted that the prevalence of food insecurity at the county level, in my home county of Terrell, was 18%. So just to recap, it's 10% at the national level, 12% at the state level of Georgia, and 18% in my home county. In the early phases of the pandemic, many observers were concerned about the potential rise of food insecurity. There were early predictions in the summer of 2020 of food insecurity rates of 20 to 30%. However, the newest report showed that the national rate held constant from 2019 to 2020 and have actually stayed the same even into 2021. Now, for the same year of 2020, the state of Georgia had a food insecurity prevalence rate of about 10.9%, which is a little lower than the year before. And for Terrell County, it had fallen to almost 18%. Now, there are multiple factors that contribute to food insecurity. Things like poverty, unemployment, and home ownership rates are important driving factors to food insecurity at the county level. The ways that Feeding America are able to predict the percentage of food insecurity at the county level are based on multiple factors, including the share of Black and Hispanic households in that county. For example, when they estimated food insecurity rates at the county level, at the state level for Georgia in 2020, they found that 19% of Black households were food insecure, while 15% of Hispanic households were food insecure, while white households had a prevalence of food insecurity of only 7%. However, for my home county, the food insecurity prevalence was 1 out of 4, so over 26% of Black households were food insecure, while only 9% of Black households were deemed food insecure in my county. Now, Georgia is not unique. The national prevalence of 10.5% of food insecurity obfuscates the disparities of food insecurity. For example, households with children the prevalence of food insecurity actually increased during the pandemic, but has dropped down a little bit in the most recent numbers. However, we see substantial divergence of food insecurity prevalence by race and ethnic households, especially for those with children. Much of the food insecurity literature takes that given Black and Hispanic households tend to be food insecure relative to their white counterparts. My colleague Craig Gunderson has worked with Native American households and says that they tend to be even more food insecure than both Black and Hispanic households. Now, but why does this disparity exist? In some work that I've done with my colleagues, slides have moved a little too fast. There we go. Why does this disparity exist? In collaboration with some of my colleagues, we explore differences in food insecurity by race and ethnicity and immigrant status. And using a particular statistical method, we control for observables that contribute to food insecurity, such as household, heads, age, and race, the marital status of that individual, the presence of children, among others. And we use a method that allows us to understand the role of the SNAP program in lowering food insecurity. Controlling for these factors, we saw that food insecurity is still higher for Black and Hispanic households relative to their white counterparts, even when you control for all of those other things that might contribute to food insecurity. That is, that there's this unexplained part of why we see this gap between Black and white households and Hispanic and white households. We also saw that there was a gap for immigrant households versus their native-born counterparts, even when you control for all of those household differences. We did find that the SNAP program, food stamps, lowers the prevalence of food insecurity. And this is good because this is part of the body of work that's gone on in the past. And we know that SNAP can actually lower food insecurity for folks who struggle with food access. The thing that we discovered, though, was that it didn't get rid of the disparity. That is, that the difference between Black and white households didn't disappear with the presence of the SNAP program. Now, we've known that this disparity has existed for years. But why have we allowed this to go on? What does this mean? What does it say about inequalities in our society? What does it speak of injustice in our country? Now, Burke and his colleagues, these are all nutritionists out of South Carolina, were looking at food insecurity in their state, and they argued that to address the racial disparities of food insecurity, we need to understand what is the role of racial discrimination in determining an individual's ability to become economically secure and have access to healthier food environments. Angela Oldham-Young argues, and she's a faculty member now at Cornell University, that the relationship between race and ethnicity and food insecurity is complex and is clearly intertwined with other established determinants of food insecurity, including poverty, unemployment, incarceration, and disability. She further argued that the economic and social oppression of people of color are important factors for this disparity. Now, these nutrition researchers, these scientists were naming racism as a critical component of the gap in food insecurity because of the implications of race in affecting economic and social well-being. Generally speaking, the field of economics hasn't really directed its models and analysis at the mechanisms of disparity observed in food insecurity. to take a step back and look at sort of the long history of how we've been thinking about food access issues in our country. And this really dates back to some early work by folks who were thinking about agriculture in America. So what I want to share with you for a few moments are some of the writings and thinkings of folks who looked at food and agriculture in this country and were trying to understand some of the problems. And one of the things that they recognized, and this is back in the 1940s, that rural folks were struggling. And in recognizing that, they also knew, but they tended to sort of gently deal with the issue of the disparities of that inequality, of that poverty. The work of these researchers over time point to some areas that may explain some of the current challenges that we see today. However, many of these early thinkers didn't really argue about the disparities, but they tended to focus on disparities in urban versus rural folks. So, for example, M.W. Wilson in 1940, he was an employee of USDA. He wrote, "But as we look into the future and think in terms of the future of democracy, of the kind of rural life that our social philosophy sanctions, and of the complexities and difficulties involved, low-income farming becomes our #1 agricultural problem." Later, in 1966, Vernon Rutan, who was the department head of agriculture economics at Minnesota, noted that rural poverty was especially bad in the South and argued that the modern or median income of rural white families was half that of urban white families in the South. Moreover, the median income of rural white families in the South was twice that of non-white families. One of the pieces directly addressing race was a 1956 paper by J. Willett, and it was titled "The Comparative Analysis of Earnings of Some Negro and White Farmers in the United States." In the notes of the paper, Willett is identified as an employee of USDA, but the research appears to be out of a dissertation from the University of Chicago. In the paper, Willett explained the income gap between white and black farmers in the South. These were commercial farmers. Willett argued that black farmers would follow economic opportunities where their earning opportunities were most closely approached those of whites. However, Willett argued that a large portion of the difference in income was because black farmers had less capital, that is, tractors and ownership of land, and lower education than their white counterparts. At the same time, acknowledging that race shaped educational opportunities and even related to earlier economic discrimination. What is striking in many of these debates, while they mention discrimination, and some have talked about and doubted whether or not discrimination occurred or not, they failed to assess or acknowledge the impact of social structures and racialized violence that limited access to USDA land grant support. In a 1982 Civil Rights Commission report, that summarized the findings of Dewey Palmer, it stated, "The black exodus from the South was caused as much by a desire to escape the racial injustices of the South as by the attention or attraction of northern wages. By 1914, Southern blacks had become mostly disenfranchised. Fear and intimidation through racial violence continued to be a part of Southern life. Between 1882 and 1918, 3,040 blacks died by lynching. Another 619 lynchings took place between 1918 and 1937. A large number of these hangings occurred because black resistance to the vicious practice of debt slavery. Evidence of the discrimination of USDA is evident in the class action lawsuit by Timothy Pickford, a black farmer from North Carolina. The Pickford versus Glickman decision acknowledged racial discrimination against black farmers at the hands of USDA. Historian Pete Daniels stated, quote, "As the Pickford decision made clear, racism had continued to circulate through federal, state, and county USDA offices long after former USDA Secretary Freeman pled to end it, and employees at every level twisted civil rights laws and subverted programs to the detriment of black farmers. Judge Paul Friedman recognized that the settlement would not restore what the black farmers had lost, but at least the settlement, he said, was a good step forward. In the 1982 Civil Rights Report, Browning found that the Farmer Home Administration, FHA, of USDA, which provided credit to farmers, could help black farmers. However, USDA did not provide the needed support and, in some cases, may have actively hindered small black operators from remaining viable. These cases indict USDA, which USDA readily recognizes as discriminatory behavior and calls into question the ambivalence of some of those early writers. The authors of research that I mentioned earlier were writing in the waning days of Jim Crow laws with segregated black and white communities. The restrictions imposed by these laws were either de jure or de facto, shaping the freedoms and experiences of people under study. The U.S. Supreme Court decided Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka in 1954, which desegregated schools. But despite these legal victories, society had been slow to change, yet the research that I mentioned earlier argued the narrative of inadequate financial and human capital development as the main reasons for disparities without acknowledging broader societal structures. Admittedly, these researchers were of a time as we are. We need to understand their work in the context or in the light of their contexts. Nevertheless, as these debates were among researchers, a devastating trend was at play regarding black land ownership. Van Newkirk, in a piece in The Atlantic called The Great Land Robbery, explained the ways black Americans during Reconstruction acquired land. Newkirk drew from W.E.B. Du Bois, who was a sociologist who studied American life. Du Bois characterized these newly freed black Americans as land hungry. Newkirk reported that 2 generations of black workers squirreled away money and went after every available and affordable plot they could, no matter how marginal or hopeless. Some found sympathetic white landowners who would sell to them. Some squatted on unused land or acquired the few homesteads available to black people. Du Bois, in his survey of black farmers in the 1900s, deduced that in the South, excluding black farm labor, black farmers' possession of, quote, more than a fourth of the farms, a little more than a tenth of the total acreage, more than a sixth of the improved acreage, and about a ninth of the farm property, and that he raised more than a sixth of the gross products according to value, and almost a fifth of the products not fed to livestock. He acknowledged that the share of production of black farmers to Southern agriculture production was below the share of total farms. Still, black farmers were on par in terms of shares of improved land and exceeded the proportion of agricultural land and property. In terms of value, Du Bois calculated that black farmers in 1900 possessed $500 million in assets, which in 2022 dollars would be about $17.6 billion of wealth today. In short, black farmers were significant contributors to agriculture. However, in the 1950s, there was a marked beginning of a great slide in black land ownership, and farmer numbers fell. The peak of black land ownership and farmers was at the turn of the century, but by 1910 to 1997, 90% of black-owned farms disappeared. In terms of value, Frances and her colleagues of research at the University of Massachusetts estimated that black farmers lost between $264 to $326 billion of value from 1920 to 2002, which they regarded is the combined market capitalization of Ford Motor Company, Starbucks, and Target combined. I'm clearly running out a little bit of time, but I want to just wrap up by making a few more points about where does this all lead us. I posit that the inequality and the support of black farmer land loss has had long-lasting effects on both well-being of black farmers and others. Given the history and the implications of this disproportionate loss of economic value and wealth, we have to ask a question about what does this mean? Based on the work from 1960, there has been some research that shows that black households depended on farm equity, which was the second largest asset for these households. While for white households, farm equity was a third, with other forms of equity of comparable value. Concern by this was raised by the lack of diversity in the wealth portfolio of black households relative to their white counterparts. However, in the late 1960s, farmland was an important source of wealth for black households and would be even of greater importance in the South given the concentration of black farmland in this region. The precipitous loss of farmland through the 1950s and 60s may point to the wealth gap that we see today. Now, we have substantial evidence of the yawning gap in wealth along racial lines. According to the Federal Reserve's Survey of Consumer Finances, in 2019, the median white household net wealth was $189,000, while for black households, the median net worth was $24,000, a difference of $165,000. And for Hispanic households, the median net wealth was $34,000. For other races, the median net wealth was $74,000. Now, matching the median wealth of households of food insecurity, we can see what looks like a relationship. That is, households with lower median wealth, with lower incomes, are more likely to be food insecure. The literature has supported this relationship between wealth and food security, which draws attention to the challenges of this historic loss of black farmland. In light of this history, how should we look at the challenge of food insecurity in the U.S.? Should we see it differently? When we support those in need, that is, when we provide food charities, I hope that we begin to see people in a fuller historical context, not just a person in need today. You see, we are composites of stories and intersecting narratives that create who we are today. My hope and my prayer is that as we extend our hands to help others, that we begin to see them more fully. Now, I would be remiss if I did not clarify that the challenges I discuss are not to pathologize black people. Rather, it is to acknowledge that there are long and complex histories that bring people to the point of need. Now, as we listen to each other's stories, as we listen to the stories of those who are in need, which I will share a little bit more tomorrow, I hope that we learn and listen to their whole story. As we construct narratives of people and of communities through our work and our service, let us not tell a single, simple story of their lives. Thank you.
Wilson. At this time, we'll give Dr. Wilson a minute to catch his breath, but he will be glad to take questions. And if you have a question, raise your hand, and we have a microphone that will be brought to you. Likewise, anyone live streaming, if you put a question in the chat function, we'll receive it.
Dr. Wilson, in more recent years, how much of a detrimental effect has there been with large farming entities buying out some of the smaller independent farmers?
Thank you. That's an important question, and I would argue that there has been an increase in the number of large farms and a sort of hollowing out of some of those smaller farms and some of those mid-sized farms. However, if you look at the data that USDA will generate, you'll see that large farms are the ones that generally produce most of the food and represent the largest amount of wealth in agriculture. However, it is important to note that there are a range of farms still existing. So you do have some smaller farms, you do have some medium-sized farms. So yes, there are challenges that large farms are buying up smaller farms. There's still a number that exist, and there have been sort of a renovation or an innovation in small and local production. I'm sure if we look around Richmond, there are probably small farmers that provide food through what are called community-supported agriculture, CSA. So there are people doing that work, but agriculture is a competitive business. It is hard to be small and not have sort of the technology to be successful. So some of it is the way that our markets work, but it has been a challenge. Thank you.
Yes, sir. To what extent? Yes, sir. To what extent do certain government programs that may be subsidized, to what extent do those help or perhaps hinder the goals of food security?
Thank you. That's an important question, and I would say.
Will you repeat the question?
Thank you. Yes, and you asked me to do that, so thank you. The question is, what role do I would assume farm subsidies, or just talking about subsidy programs in general, contribute to? Farm price subsidies contribute to food security, and I would say there are a couple of ways of looking at that. So USDA and the federal government have a long tradition of subsidizing U.S. agriculture. However, that subsidization has actually changed in recent years, where instead of providing what would be considered price supports, where farmers were guaranteed higher prices or offered higher prices for owning things like tobacco quota, those policies have mostly shifted away, and now what the government does provide is subsidization for loans and for crop insurance. And so these policies actually help many farmers stay in business, and that production is important. We have in the U.S. relatively low food prices. That doesn't mean that folks don't still struggle, but we do have a relatively robust food economy that provides food. Now, I want to be very clear. There are many who would say that's not sufficient because of the problems that we see with food security. Now, it is important that these programs and these policies do exist. We have, as I said, modified a lot of them. They do provide critical agricultural production here in the U.S., but a lot of the, if you will, low prices that may come off the farm actually get bid up because of the marketing process of transforming those crops into the foods that we eat, the processed foods that we have. So it's not like those benefits always are distributed evenly. So I would say if we lost some of those policies, there could be some significant consequences. Higher food prices, as we are experiencing today with inflation, really do hurt folks who are struggling. There has been plenty of research that shows that in markets where there are higher prices, there's greater food insecurity. So anything that might cause food prices to go up would have a negative effect on people who are struggling with food access. So we would need to think very carefully about how we mitigate or manage these policies into the future. Now, I want to add one more point to that. We also live in a global economy, and so there are food products that are produced not just here in the U.S., but we have production that comes out of Mexico, out of other parts of the world that provide many food products. And as a nation, we are a net exporter of foods. So we really do provide food outside the U.S., and that's an important role that we play as an economy. So for all those reasons, there is a connection. I'm careful to make a direct line to say, if you got rid of this other thing would happen, but it is important to know that these policies have been beneficial to a number of farmers, but have also created some challenges for some.
I'll give you a question from our live stream audience. Do you have statistics that break down food insecurity for single mothers, whatever their race or ethnicity?
Sure, yes, those data are available. I don't know the numbers offhand, but I can break this down in sort of relative terms. So the question about who experiences food insecurity, single-parent households are more likely to be food insecure than other households. So if it's single mothers are going to be more likely to be food insecure, same as single dads who are food insecure. But single mothers are more likely to be food insecure. And we can imagine when we think about differences in incomes by gender, when we also understand the challenges of childcare and single-parent household with working and work can be really challenging. So for all those reasons, we see this difference in food insecurity rates.
Okay. We'll take one in the sanctuary, and then I have another one virtual.
Hi, this is maybe a little more data specific about inside baseball or something, but I'm curious, you mentioned the data and the difficulties with collecting data for the unhoused and the undocumented right now. Are there, when I look at the data from before the pandemic and now, I know that just happened, but do you see ways to collect data in a more efficient way than telephone calls? Because somebody answers the phone.
It is, yes, and I will
Repeat that.
Yes, the question was, are there more efficient ways of collecting data about food insecurity given that there are challenges with using a telephone-based survey? And I would say I'm sure that there are plenty of government workers who sleep not at all because of this question. And there are a number of different ways that people have discovered how to do surveys actually outside of phones. So during the beginning of the pandemic, the federal government ran a survey called the Pulse Survey. And I remember getting the text, and it's a text survey, and it's become a much easier way of evaluating important questions. And I would say, in general, federal government trying to collect data has become much more complicated. The data that's often used for USDA has become harder because folks aren't really willing to share a lot of data. And there are lots of questions and concerns about data availability and access for security reasons. So I think folks are finding new ways of accessing data through new technologies. So many folks have cell phones. Even people with limited resources are able to access cell phones. So that's not my particular specialty, but those are some of the things I have been seeing. But thank you for that question.
One question from our audience afar. In urban areas, what can we do to alleviate the food deserts that exist?
Okay. So in urban areas, how can we alleviate food deserts? So let me take a step back and talk about what that looks like. And I would add there are urban area food deserts, or at least by the U.S. Department of Agriculture's definition, and then there are also food deserts in rural areas. And this idea of a food desert is community where the distance to the grocery store is beyond a certain length. I think in urban areas it's a mile or maybe a mile and a half, and for rural areas it's 10 miles. And so this idea of food deserts actually really rose in prominence. People were very concerned about this, and rightly so. This idea of, are there people really struggling to access food because it's difficult to get to the grocery store? It's just not available. And the pandemic has shown us just how difficult and how unsettling it is to access food when you weren't sure about what you were going to face when you went to the grocery store. But this idea of food deserts has lost some of the concern, and I want to be clear. I don't want to mean that I don't suggest that there isn't a problem, but there's been more data that suggests that people have different ways of getting to the grocery store by riding with a friend. So the physical distance may not be the main problem. It may be the cost of doing it. So people are riding with a friend or using public transportation when it's available and other means. But the challenge of available food is one that is important to consider. There have been many folks who found that there are many folks found that when you are able to make food access a little bit easier, it makes things better in terms of what people are able to do. So USDA right now is very much interested in expanding how people can use SNAP benefits, for example, using online grocery stores. They are before the pandemic, there was an effort to address or try to encourage folks to use SNAP benefits online, thinking it could help get over some of these food desert challenges. But of course, once the pandemic hit, everyone realized we need to find a way to make this available to more people. So they expanded the pilot such that almost everyone who uses SNAP benefits can use it to purchase foods online. I think there's some real questions about what does that mean? What does it mean to use these means of grocery shopping and the extra costs associated with it? So yes, there are food deserts. Yes, there are real challenges of accessing food. But are people finding other ways of accessing? And it looks like there are.
Thank you. I think that wraps up our evening. Thank you all for being here. One more question, Holly? Okay, one more.
To follow up on food deserts, how does historic redlining play a role in the food desert creation and current status?
Yeah. No, thank you for that question. So the question is about how does the history of redlining, which designated or limited people's ability to get housing, home loans, affect food deserts today or food access issues today. And I would say the way I would think about it is it has something to do with wealth creation or the limitation of wealth creation. Part of the challenge that I was trying to make in my presentation is to say that when folks have not been able to develop the wealth haven't been able to develop wealth for whatever reason, it limits current food access issues, or it challenges that. And I would argue the same would be true with redlining, that these kinds of policies that limited the wealth of individuals actually has long-running implications in terms of access to financial resources to purchase food, and actually even to invest in human capital, to invest in education, to be able to do better.
Okay, thank you. Thank you again, Dr. Wilson.